Thank you so much. Okay, so here is Lelia's Kiss. Lelia's Kiss puts together many years of my readings and interest in Italian Renaissance comedy. My book interprets and analyzes more than 100 16th century comedies, ranging well behind the current canon. It does so less in terms of literary topoi or the imitation of earlier literary sources typical of traditional criticism, but more as a Renaissance tapestry, woven out of the imaginative interplay of this text with the social and cultural world of the Renaissance, of which they were a vital and exciting part. Moving beyond the distinction between text and context in literary analysis, I focus on what I call the social script, or the way comedies incorporated, commented upon, laughed at, played with, mocked, and imagined their social and cultural world. As social scripts, comedies created a dialogue with the cultural presuppositions of their day, with contemporary social norms, and also with contemporary social tensions, preoccupations, and desires. And this dialogue is what I study in Lelia's Kiss. My critical approach is based on close reading of all the texts utilized, and many more, and a larger body of Renaissance literature as well, be it philosophical, artistic, legal, or moralistic. The frequent laments by modern critics, especially in Italy, that these comedies lacked originality, were too based on ancient models, and relied on plots that were repetitive and improbable, may actually, in my vision, say more about the anachronistic and narrow way that they have looked at these comedies than the comedies themselves. The simple fact that around 300 comedies were published in the first few decades of the 16th century, and many in 2, 3, or even 10, 20 editions, such as La Calandra or Mandragola, suggests the need to rethink these tired dismissals. In large part, I argue in my book that their popularity was due to the fact that their plot lines, scenes, and characters turned on issues that were of great interest at the time, such as gender, sex, and marriage, even if the particular Renaissance take on these issues was relatively distant from the modern. And the public for these comedies was not only those who were able to attend performances, usually during carnival and often in private upper-class settings, but also an extensive reading public, including people read too. So simply put, these comedies participated in Renaissance culture and society, imaginatively and humorously representing it to itself, and at the same time contributing to both its stability and its changes, as we will see. The book begins with Women in Men's Clothing, a chapter that examines the role of the positive scripting of women cross-dressed as males, going beyond the traditional scholarly vision of the disorderly woman in pants. This is the famous engravings of the courtesan, the Venetian courtesan, wearing breeches under her gown. In order to illuminate the complexity of Renaissance gender distinction, there are two pictures. So the female characters in comedies represent a different image. This is the disorderly woman in pants, while my heroines are represented very positively, as we will see. The numerous comedies that present young women characters that cross-dressed as men are a sign of how great the interest was at the time in issues that turn on sexual identity and what we would today call gender roles. For unlikely as it may seem at first, one of the most interesting aspects about the way cross-dressed characters were scripted in Renaissance comedies was the way that they allowed audiences, readers, and authors to imaginatively play with the cultural signs that were seen as denoting sexual difference. Thus, when we use the term gender in the modern sense to denote the cultural signs that a society used to mark sexual difference, the term uncannily describes one of the main areas of play in Renaissance comedies. So these comedies scripted a fascinating series of young women dressed as men who successfully studied, traveled, inherited wealth, and carried on business, or perhaps most importantly, picked their own husbands without interference from their fathers or families. And thus, doing this, they called attention to the way in which the social and cultural constraints normally placed upon women limited their opportunities and contributed to a more general vision of women as passive and naturally belonging at home under the control of men. In the imaginative vision of these comedies, however, education, freedom of movement, and culture for women subtly triumphed over nature. Studies of English Renaissance drama have suggested that such performances turn on a contemporary sense of malleability of gender and uncertainty or fluidity of sex. When Italian comedies played with the young woman's ability to pass as a young man in cross-dressing plots, however, it was not because gender distinctions were unclear or fluid. On the contrary, it was clear what signified being a woman socially and sexually. In Italian theater, to quote a famous sentence, clothes do not make the man or the woman either. The idea of sexual difference was reinforced by dress distinction, but not created by them in any essential way. Instead, the sexual ambiguity that permitted a young woman's character to pass as a young man played upon the liminal status of early adolescence, where youths of either sex were seen as virtually interchangeable. Only the young could pass for any significant time. And, as the protagonists of numerous comedies demonstrate, they did so opening a rich and intriguing perspective on the way sexual difference was understood as a social and cultural construct, and at the same time adding an important imaginative dimension to the contemporary debates on women. Women characters, dressed as men in Renaissance comedy, also provided an interesting perspective on 16th century perceptions of female sexuality and homoeroticism, a topic that has been generally dismissed by the critical literature as invisible in the period in Italy. Chapter 2, Woman with Woman, examines a number of comedies that are very revealing about the perception of such relationship, analyzing them as part of a larger cultural process that began to make them visible in the 16th century. The most usual way of presenting female-female desire in comedies was via a pair of characters, one male, one female, each cross-dressing to pass as the opposite sex, which created an interesting range of misunderstandings where characters thought they were in love with or sexually attracted to a member of the same sex. This allowed such attractions to be safely explored on stage, for while a woman cross-dressed as a man thought that she had fallen in love with another woman and could discuss and reflect on this desire, the audience knew that she was in love with a man cross-dressed as a woman. In a few comedies, however, perhaps notably in the Anonymous Veneziana, even the misunderstandings of cross-dressing were dropped, and homoerotic practices between women were openly presented. Tellingly, however, sex and desire between young women were presented in these comedies positively, in terms of heroic women characters attracted to other women in a manner totally dissociated from marriage, duty, family, and reproduction, as well as from the more negative vision and typical of the period of female lust and disruptive passions. So this positive portrayal of female sexuality and love between women aimed at pleasure has been virtually totally overlooked by scholars. Love between women is presented as possible, and significantly, in comedies, it was not considered as transgressive as adultery with a male lover, or as a woman loving and attempting to marry a man that her family had not chosen for her. Rather, it was regularly presented as a positive, even heroic motive for noble deeds. Moreover, a number of these comedies demonstrate that sexual pleasure could be enjoyed in a relationship with a man or a woman, which suggests that sexual relationships were perceived more as a continuum rather than a simple binary division of sexual practice between heterosexual on the one hand and homosexual on the other. And just use the words to be clear. The scripting of young women in love with other women thus gave positive voice to female desire and was a most significant Renaissance innovation in the portrayal of women on stage. Chapter 3 looks at the way masculine identity and gender roles were portrayed via young male characters cross-dressing as women. Their motives for doing so were diverse, but once more turned on Renaissance practical realities: to enter as a maid or a servant the homes of their beloved, to disguise their identity from family enemies or from penalties inflicted by governments, to escape slavery, or at least mollify its demands,